For most of the Second World War, German U-boat commanders were not gambling with their lives. They were following a system built on experience, tested through thousands of patrols, and reinforced by results that, for several years, were undeniably effective. By 1941 and 1942, the submarine war in the Atlantic appeared to favor Germany. Merchant ships were being sunk faster than they could be replaced, escort forces were stretched thin, and large areas of the ocean remained effectively unguarded. Within that environment, German doctrine did not reward boldness for its own sake. It rewarded discipline, patience, and adherence to a small set of survival rules. These rules were not arbitrary. They were shaped by the physical limits of technology and geography at the time. The first rule was simple. The night belonged to the submarine. Surfacing after dark reduced the risk of detection. Visual spotting was unreliable. Early radar systems were inconsistent, and aircraft could not remain over open ocean for long periods. At night, a U-boat could recharge its batteries, ventilate the interior, receive radio traffic, and maneuver at surface speed. Remaining submerged indefinitely was neither practical. Batteries depleted quickly, air quality deteriorated, and speed was severely limited. Under those conditions, surfacing at night was not reckless. It was the safest moment of a patrol. The second rule followed naturally. When detected, dive deep. Allied sonar, while improving, still had clear limitations. Detection ranges were short, contact was easily lost when surface ships passed overhead, and depth charges required accurate estimation rather than by diving deep, reducing speed, and minimizing noise, a submarine could exploit those gaps. Escorts often exhausted their weapons or fuel and were eventually forced to return to convoy protection. Time, in these encounters, usually favored the submarine. The third rule tied everything together. Wait them out. German commanders understood that escorts could not remain indefinitely on a single contact. Convoys had schedules, fuel consumption mattered, and aircraft coverage was temporary. By remaining submerged and disciplined, a U-boat could often survive an encounter without ever firing a shot. This approach was taught, practiced, and reinforced at every level of training. Taken together, these rules formed a coherent survival doctrine. They explained past successes and offered a reliable framework for decision-making. This is an important point to understand, because what happened in 1943 was not the failure of bad doctrine. It was the collapse of doctrine that had been correct under earlier conditions. By early 1941, U-boat commanders were still doing exactly what they had been trained to do. Surfacing at night still felt correct, diving deep still felt prudent, waiting still felt disciplined. What was no longer clear was why those decisions were producing different results. The first signs of trouble did not arrive as a single shock. They arrived as a series of small contradictions, encounters that ended slightly differently than expected, patrols that lasted slightly longer than planned, and losses that no longer fit familiar patterns. At first, German commanders did what any disciplined force would do. They adjusted tactics within the existing framework. They surfaced later. They dove sooner. They reduced radio transmissions. None of this appeared unreasonable. The rules themselves still seemed valid. But beneath those adjustments, something fundamental was changing. The first rule to fracture was the oldest and most trusted. The night belonged to the submarine. For years, darkness had provided concealment. Aircraft were limited by range, fuel, and navigation. Even when a submarine was sighted at night, pursuit was brief. The attacker would eventually have to disengage. That assumption was deeply ingrained. In 1943, it was becoming unreliable. Submarines began reporting aircraft contacts at night that did not break off. Some boats were detected without ever visually spotting the attacker. Others were illuminated suddenly, attacked, and forced to dive without warning. These incidents were initially attributed to chance or improved coordination, but their frequency steadily increased. The logic behind night surfacing still made sense. Darkness still reduced visual detection, but the environment no longer behaved as it had before. What had changed was endurance. Aircraft were no longer appearing briefly and disappearing. They were arriving, remaining overhead, and waiting. For the first time, being on the surface at night carried a level of risk comparable to daylight operations. This shift alone was destabilizing, but it triggered a second fracture. Diving deep, the core response to detection, began to lose its protective value. In earlier years, diving deep bought time. Escorts lost contact, Depth charges were imprecise. Once submerged and quiet, a submarine could often wait out the attack. By 1943, repeated submergence was becoming a liability. Aircraft encounters increasingly forced submarines to dive before batteries were fully charged. Escorts arriving afterward found targets already constrained by limited power and reduced speed. Each forced dive shortened the window in which a submarine could maneuver freely. Submerged endurance was no longer a reserve. It was being consumed preemptively. From a technical standpoint, nothing about diving had changed. Batteries still functioned as designed. Motors still ran quietly at low speed. The doctrine was intact. What had changed was how often those systems were being stressed, and how little time remained to recover. The rule still worked, but only once. After that, its effectiveness degraded rapidly. This created a cascading problem. A submarine that could not remain submerged indefinitely had to surface sooner. A submarine that surfaced sooner faced detection risks that had not existed before. Each response increased dependence on the next, tightening the cycle rather than relieving it. The third rule, wait them out, was the last to fracture and the most consequential. Historically, time favored the submarine. Escorts were constrained by fuel, ammunition, and the need to remain with the convoy. Aircraft coverage was temporary. Patience was not just virtuous, it was effective. By mid-1943, this assumption was increasingly false. Escorts were no longer abandoning contacts quickly. Some attacks lasted hours. Others resumed after brief interruptions. Submarines reported being reacquired repeatedly, even after long periods of silence. From the German perspective, this was deeply confusing. The ocean had not changed. Escort ships had not multiplied overnight. And yet, waiting no longer produced the expected outcome. Individually, none of these developments invalidated doctrine. Together, they began to undermine it. For U-boat commanders, this created a new and unfamiliar kind of risk. Survival no longer depended on making the correct move at the correct time. It depended on how many correct moves remained available. But each correct decision now consumed resources faster than they could be restored. This shift did not produce immediate panic. German crews remained professional. Reports remained measured. But beneath that discipline, the margin for error was shrinking. Mistakes, when they occurred, were rarely dramatic. They were small misjudgments, surfacing a little too soon, remaining submerged a little too long, assuming an aircraft would disengage when it did not. Under earlier conditions, these errors were survivable. Under the new conditions, they accumulated. By the spring of 1943, U-boat commanders were no longer operating within a stable system. They were operating within a narrowing corridor of options. What made this phase especially dangerous was that the system had not yet visibly collapsed. Losses were increasing, but not uniformly. Some boats still returned. Some patrols still succeeded. From a command perspective, there was no clear signal that the rules themselves were obsolete. Yet on the operational level, something was unmistakably wrong. Encounters were lasting longer. Recoveries were taking more time. And boats that followed the rulebook precisely were disappearing at a rate that discipline alone could no longer explain. By the spring of 1943, U-boat commanders were no longer facing isolated problems, but patterns they could observe without yet understanding. What German commanders were encountering could not be resolved at the operational level. Patrol reports described encounters that no longer behaved according to established expectations. Aircraft appeared where none should have been able to operate. Escorts maintained pressure longer than expected. Time, once a reliable ally, now worked against them. What was missing from their understanding was not a tactic, a weapon, or a single technological breakthrough. It was a change in the structure of the battlefield itself. For most of the war, the Atlantic had effectively been a two-dimensional environment for submarines. Threats came from the surface. Detection came from ships. Aircraft were an intermittent concern, constrained by range, endurance, and coordination. Between those constraints existed large stretches of ocean, where submarines could operate with relative freedom. That condition no longer existed. The decisive change came from above the surface, not below it. For the first time in the war, an aircraft could reach the central Atlantic, remain there for extended periods, and operate as a persistent presence rather than a fleeting one. This was not simply an increase in patrol frequency. It was the removal of a boundary that German doctrine had quietly relied upon since the beginning of the conflict. The aircraft responsible was the B-24 Liberator. The B-24 was not introduced as a submarine killer in the conventional sense. It did not replace escort ships, sonar, or depth charges. Its significance lay in a more fundamental capability: reach and endurance. With a range far greater than previous patrol aircraft, the B-24 could fly deep into areas of the Atlantic that had previously been inaccessible. More importantly, it could remain there long enough to matter. What had once been brief encounters became sustained pressure. What had once been gaps in coverage became continuous observation. This single change reshaped the operational environment. For U-boats, the most immediate consequence was the disappearance of the Atlantic air gap, the vast mid-ocean region where aircraft could not previously operate. That gap had not been a tactical detail. It had been a sanctuary. It allowed submarines to surface safely, recharge batteries, coordinate attacks, and reposition without constant threat from the air. With the arrival of long-range aircraft, that sanctuary vanished. Night, which had once guaranteed concealment, no longer ensured disengagement. Aircraft equipped with improved radar could locate surfaced submarines regardless of visibility. Once detected, the B-24 did not need to attack immediately. It could remain overhead, track the target, and force a response. That response was almost always the same: dive. This is where the B-24's true impact became clear. It did not need to sink submarines directly to be decisive. By compelling repeated dives, it drained the very resources submarines depended on to survive. Batteries depleted faster, air quality deteriorated, speed was reduced, options narrowed. From that moment onward, the submarine was no longer choosing when to submerge. It was reacting. The effects of this shift extended well beyond the aircraft itself. Once submerged, a U-boat became vulnerable to surface forces that had been waiting for precisely that condition. Escorts, guided by improved coordination, could take over the pursuit. Sonar contact was maintained longer. Attacks were repeated rather than abandoned. The B-24, in this sense, did not replace existing anti-submarine measures. It synchronized them. For German commanders, this transformation was difficult to recognize in real time. There was no single engagement that revealed the full picture. Losses occurred across different patrols, under different circumstances. Some submarines were destroyed by aircraft, others by escorts, others after long periods of pursuit that ended far from the original point of contact. What unified these outcomes was not the method of destruction, but the sequence that led to it: aircraft detection, forced submergence, depleted endurance, prolonged pursuit, destruction. This sequence had not existed before. From a doctrinal perspective, the most damaging aspect of this change was that it invalidated multiple survival rules simultaneously. Surfacing at night no longer provided safety. Diving deep no longer guaranteed escape. Waiting no longer ensured disengagement. None of these rules had been abandoned. They were still being followed, but they were now being applied in an environment they had not been designed to survive. For the men inside the submarines, the shift was subtle but unsettling. Patrols felt different. Decisions carried more weight. Encounters that once ended quietly now extended without resolution. The sense that time was working in their favor began to erode. The rules had not failed because they were wrong. They were beginning to collide with conditions they had never been designed to account for. Convoy ONS5 was not intended to demonstrate anything. It was simply another engagement, fought under conditions that initially appeared familiar. ONS5 was not an especially valuable target. It consisted largely of slow, outbound merchant ships traveling from Britain toward North America. The convoy was poorly protected at the outset, operating in difficult weather and moving through waters that had historically favored submarine attack. From the German perspective, it appeared vulnerable. More than 30 U-boats converged on the convoy between April 28 and May 5, 1943. Initial contact followed familiar patterns. Submarines shadowed the convoy, reported its position, and prepared coordinated night attacks. Over the first days of engagement, several merchant ships were sunk. To the U-boat commanders involved, this appeared to confirm that the rulebook still worked. The early phase of the battle reinforced every expectation German doctrine had created. But beneath those surface successes, the conditions of the engagement were already different. The weather was poor. Visibility was limited. Aircraft operations were intermittent rather than continuous. Under earlier circumstances, these factors would have favored the submarines. Instead, they concealed the presence of a system that was quietly tightening around them. As the battle progressed, Allied reinforcements began to arrive. Escort groups were strengthened. Coordination improved. More importantly, Air coverage, though uneven, extended further and persisted longer than German commanders anticipated. U-boats that surfaced at night to reposition or recharge found themselves detected more frequently. When they dove, they were often forced to do so earlier and under less favorable conditions than planned. Batteries were not fully replenished. Crews entered prolonged, submerged operations already constrained. This is where the logic of the collapse became visible. Aircraft contact did not need to be continuous to be decisive. Each forced dive reduced endurance. Each reduction in endurance increased predictability. Submarines surfaced sooner than expected. Escorts reacquired contact more easily. Attacks that once ended in disengagement now resumed repeatedly. For the U-boats involved, ONS5 did not feel like a single battle. It felt like an extended sequence of interruptions, short periods of opportunity punctuated by repeated, exhausting evasions. From an operational standpoint, the convoy itself was becoming less important than the submarine's ability to remain effective. By May 4th, the balance had shifted decisively. U-boats began to be destroyed in rapid succession. Some were sunk by surface escorts after prolonged pursuit. Others were lost following earlier air encounters that had already degraded their capacity to evade. The exact cause of destruction varied, but the sequence leading to it was increasingly consistent. The pattern observed earlier in the campaign now unfolded in real time. Forced dives, shrinking endurance, and relentless reacquisition. What made ONS5 different from earlier convoy battles was not the scale of losses alone, but their concentration in time. Submarines were being eliminated faster than they could disengage or reposition. Survivors reported near constant pressure, with little opportunity to recover between contacts. From the German command perspective, this pattern was alarming. U-boats were still sinking ships, but the exchange rate had reversed. Losses were no longer acceptable by any rational measure. The tactical successes achieved early in the engagement were being offset, and then overwhelmed by the rapid destruction of experienced crews and operational boats. For the men aboard the submarines, the collapse was not experienced as a dramatic turning point. It was experienced as exhaustion. Crews spent extended periods submerged, operating on reduced power and deteriorating air. Surfacing felt increasingly dangerous. Remaining submerged felt increasingly unsustainable. Decisions that once felt routine now carried disproportionate consequences. There was no single moment when the battle was clearly lost. Instead, it became clear that there was no way to win it. By the time ONS5 disengaged, the results were unmistakable. While the convoy had suffered losses, the U-boat force had suffered something far more damaging. Multiple submarines had been destroyed. Others had been forced to withdraw. The operational tempo of the attacking force had collapsed. ONS5 was not the largest battle of the Atlantic War. It was not the most dramatic, but it was the clearest demonstration that the underlying mechanics of submarine warfare were changing. In May 1943, that pattern translated into decisions at the highest level of command. That month, German U-boat losses reached a level unprecedented in the Atlantic War. 41 submarines were destroyed in a single month. Many of them were commanded by experienced officers whose training and combat knowledge could not be replaced quickly, if at all. The loss was not merely numerical, it was institutional. From a strategic standpoint, this represented a decisive break. Submarines were being lost faster than they could be built, trained, and deployed. Even more critically, they were being lost under conditions that offered no clear path to adaptation. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had built the U-boat arm into Germany's most effective strategic weapon, was forced to confront a reality he had long resisted. The losses were not the result of poor coordination, temporary disadvantage, or isolated technological setbacks. They reflected a fundamental shift in the balance of the campaign. On May 24, 1943, Dönitz ordered a withdrawal of U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. This decision marked the effective end of Germany's offensive submarine campaign. U-boats did not disappear overnight. They continued to operate in smaller numbers, in different theaters, and with modified tactics. New designs were proposed, countermeasures were explored. But the central premise of the campaign, that submarines could operate aggressively and sustainably against Allied shipping, had been broken. The reason was not that U-boats had become obsolete as machines. It was that the environment in which they had once thrived no longer existed. By mid-1943, the Atlantic had become a space of continuous observation. Long-range aircraft denied sanctuary. Surface escorts operated in coordinated groups, Detection led not to brief encounters, but to prolonged pressure. Recovery time, once built into the rhythm of submarine warfare, had vanished. From this point forward, every patrol began under a different assumption. Survival could no longer be taken for granted, even if doctrine was followed perfectly. For the men who continued to serve aboard U-boats, this shift was deeply personal. Patrols grew longer, more stressful, and less predictable. Crews operated with the knowledge that escape was no longer a function of patience alone. The margin for error had narrowed to the point where experience and discipline could no longer reliably compensate for circumstance. What had once been a contest of tactics had become a contest of endurance, and the submarines were losing. That realization now applied far beyond any single convoy. The broader significance of Black May lies not in the number of ships sunk or lost, but in what it revealed about modern warfare. The U-boat campaign did not collapse because one weapon proved superior to another. It collapsed because a set of assumptions about time, space, and limitation were invalidated simultaneously. The arrival of long-range aircraft did not merely add another threat. It removed the gaps that had allowed submarines to function as independent predators. Once those gaps disappeared, every other anti-submarine measure became more effective. Sonar mattered more. Escorts mattered more. Persistence mattered more. In this sense, the aircraft that changed the war did not win it alone. It rewrote the conditions under which victory and survival were possible. This pattern would repeat itself in later conflicts. Whenever a force builds its doctrine around the existence of safe spaces, limited coverage, or predictable disengagement, it becomes vulnerable to changes that erase those assumptions. The danger lies not in failing to follow the rules, but in continuing to follow them after the world has changed. The U-boats of 1943 did not lose because they abandoned discipline. They lost because discipline was no longer enough. By the end of Black May, the Battle of the Atlantic had passed its point of decision. Allied shipping losses would continue, but never again at a rate that threatened the outcome of the war. Industrial capacity, logistics, and manpower would now flow across the ocean largely uninterrupted. The submarine war, once Germany's most effective strategic weapon, had been reduced to a costly struggle for survival. And at the center of that transformation was a simple but devastating realization. The rules that had once governed life and death beneath the Atlantic no longer applied. Not because they were broken, but because the battlefield had been fundamentally changed.